The Great War had ended, but it had not healed. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Europe lay shattered, not just in its cities and fields, but in the deeper fabric of its societies. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed crushing reparations on Germany, stripped her of territory, and assigned her the full moral and legal guilt for the war. For millions of Germans, this was not merely humiliating. It was an open wound. Inflation swallowed savings overnight. The Weimar Republic, fragile and newly born, struggled against both communist uprisings on its left and nationalist paramilitary groups on its right. In this vacuum of despair, resentment became currency. Across Europe, women who had entered the workforce during the war found themselves pushed back into domestic roles. The social order that had briefly cracked open now reasserted itself with a kind of anxious rigidity. Yet beneath that surface, the disruption lingered. In Berlin, in Vienna, in Paris, nightlife thrived in the shadows of grief. Cabarets, brothels, and underground clubs filled with men who had returned from the trenches carrying memories they could not share and desires they could not name in polite company. The oldest profession, as it has always been called, though the phrase flatters no one, had existed in every era of European history. What changed in the interwar years was not the existence of prostitution, but its scale, its visibility, and increasingly, its relationship to the machinery of the modern state. Germany, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, Japan, each nation handled the question of commercial sex differently, and each would find that question returned to them with savage force once the Second Great War began. In the Weimar Republic, prostitution operated in a complex legal gray zone. Street solicitation was technically forbidden, but licensed brothels existed, and health clinics monitored registered sex workers for venereal disease. Social reformers debated fiercely, some calling for abolition, others for regulation, still others for the full criminalization of clients rather than workers. These debates were not merely academic. Venereal disease, especially syphilis and gonorrhea, had devastated armies in the First World War, and military planners across Europe were already calculating how to manage male sexuality in any future conflict. In Japan, the institution of licensed prostitution had deep historical roots. The pleasure quarters of the Edo period, Yoshiwara in Tokyo, Shimabara in Kyoto, had been regulated, enclosed, and taxed by the shogunate for centuries. By the early 20th century, the Meiji modernization had formally abolished the feudal system, but could not dissolve the economic and cultural structures that sustained it. Poor rural families, devastated by drought and depression, sometimes sold daughters to brokers who placed them in licensed houses. The girls, some as young as 14 or 15, signed contracts that bound them for years, theoretically as loans against their earnings, practically as debt bondage. This system would later provide the model, and in some cases the direct infrastructure, for what the Japanese military would construct across Asia. In the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution had brought with it an ideology that formally condemned prostitution as a product of capitalist exploitation. The state established rehabilitation centers for sex workers in the 1920s, framing them not as criminals, but as victims of bourgeois society who needed to be reintegrated into the socialist collective. In practice, the results were mixed at best. Poverty did not vanish because ideology commanded it. Women who had few other means of survival continued to exchange sex for money or goods, even as the official line condemned the practice. By the 1930s, as Stalinism tightened its grip, the subject became almost entirely invisible in public discourse, not solved, but suppressed. In France, a system of regulated brothels, maisons closes, had existed since the Napoleonic era. The state licensed these establishments, required regular medical inspections of the women inside, and collected taxes on their operations. French military authorities had long maintained that the availability of controlled, inspected sexual services was essential to maintaining troop morale and reducing rates of venereal disease. The First World War had seen French authorities establish a network of military brothels near the front lines, establishments officially euphemized as bordels militaires de campagne, or field military brothels. This precedent was not forgotten. Britain maintained a different posture, at least officially. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the Victorian era, which had allowed police to forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution, had been repealed in 1886 following a fierce campaign by feminist activists led by Josephine Butler. But repeal did not eliminate the practice. It drove it underground, made sex workers less visible but more vulnerable, and left the British military facing the same venereal disease problem as everyone else, without the same explicit infrastructure for managing it. In all these societies, the women who sold sex were largely invisible as individuals. They appeared in statistics, in police reports, in medical journals, but rarely in their own voices, rarely as agents of their own lives, rarely as anything other than a problem to be managed. This invisibility would deepen catastrophically during the war to come. What had been managed, debated, exploited, and sometimes reformed in peacetime would be systematized into something far more organized, far more coercive, and far more deadly once the machinery of total war began to turn. The economic crisis of the 1930s struck with particular force across Europe and Asia. The Great Depression destroyed agricultural prices in rural Japan and Korea, pushing millions of families to the edge of survival. In Germany, unemployment reached catastrophic levels, and women faced impossible choices. The rise of fascism brought with it a peculiar contradiction. Nazi ideology exalted the German woman as mother and homemaker, the guardian of racial purity and domestic virtue, while simultaneously planning an empire of conquest that would require managing the sexuality of millions of soldiers far home. These two imperatives could not be reconciled except through violence, and violence is precisely what the years ahead would bring. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. Within months, the Nazi regime had begun dismantling the Weimar Republic's regulatory framework around prostitution, not to protect sex workers, but to reorganize them according to racial ideology. Jewish women were forbidden from working in licensed houses. Since sexual contact between Jews and Germans was defined by the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, racial defilement, a crime punishable by imprisonment, German women working in the sex trade were subjected to increasing surveillance, categorized, and in some cases confined, not to protect them, to make them available for state purposes and to prevent spread of disease among the military. In Japan, the Imperial Army had been fighting in China since 1931, when the Kwantung Army staged the Mukden incident as a pretext for occupying Manchuria. By 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War had begun in earnest with the fall of Nanking, and the atrocities that followed, the rape of Nanking, the systematic murder and sexual violence committed by Japanese troops against the civilian population, shocked the world and alarmed Japanese military authorities for reasons both moral and strategic. Mass rape was tactically uncontrolled, politically damaging, and medically dangerous. It generated international condemnation and created exactly the epidemic of venereal disease that military planners feared. The decision, attributed to various senior officers, including Lieutenant General Yasuji Okamura, was to establish a controlled system of military brothels that would channel male sexuality away from civilian populations and toward a managed, inspect supply. The women who would be placed inside these facilities had not yet been gathered. That gathering was begun. By the late 1930s, Europe was sliding toward a second catastrophe. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. The machinery of total conflict began to turn again, faster, wider, and with a ruthlessness that the previous generation could not have imagined. Within that machinery, the bodies of women, millions of them, across every occupied territory, would become instruments of policy, objects of transaction, and targets of violence on a scale history had never witnessed. To understand what happened to them, it is necessary to understand not just the war, but the world that built it. No aspect of wartime sexual exploitation has been more extensively documented, more bitterly contested, or more morally devastating in its implications than the system of military comfort stations established by the Imperial Japanese Army across Asia between the 1930s and 1945. The women caught up in this system, Korean, Chinese, Filipino, Dutch, Taiwanese, Indonesian, and others, would come to be known by the Japanese euphemism ienfu, meaning comfort women. The phrase concealed a reality of coercion, confinement, and systematic rape that has taken decades for survivors, historians, and governments to acknowledge. The origins of the system are inseparable from the structure of the Imperial Japanese Army itself. Unlike Western armies, which largely tolerated informal prostitution markets near military bases, the Japanese military sought to control and institutionalize the provision of sexual services to its troops. The arguments made internally by military planners were framed in the language of efficiency and disease prevention. Uncontrolled access to local civilian women produced mass sexual violence, diplomatic incidents, and the spread of a venereal disease that reduced combat effectiveness. A managed system, they argued, would address all three problems. The first comfort stations appeared in Shanghai in 1932, following the January 20th incident, when Japanese and Chinese forces clashed in the city. These early establishments drew from existing local prostitution networks and were relatively small in scale. They established, however, a precedent and a model. After the full-scale war began in 1937, the system expanded with extraordinary speed, eventually encompassing an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 women. The precise figures remain disputed, serving in facilities that stretched from Manchuria to the Philippines, from Burma to the Pacific Islands. The methods by which women were recruited into the system varied by region and period, but deception and coercion were the consistent threads. In Korea, then a Japanese colony, recruiters working on behalf of the military or in collaboration with it traveled to rural villages. Some offered women and their families contracts describing work in factories, restaurants, or hospitals in Manchuria or China. The wages described were substantial by Korean rural standards. Families struggling with debt agreed. Girls as young as 14, 15, 16 signed documents they often could not fully read. They were told they would be working as nurses or factory workers or waitresses. They were not told they would be taken to military brothels. Some women were taken by outright force. Testimonies gathered by researchers and human rights organizations from the 1990s onward describe Japanese soldiers and Korean recruiters entering homes and removing women at gunpoint, or seizing women on the streets and loading them onto trucks. The distinction between the deceptive recruitment and the violent abduction was, in practice, less meaningful than it might appear. Once the women arrived at the comfort stations, the outcome was the same. The stations themselves were typically organized in close proximity. to military installations. A woman assigned to a comfort station would be given a Japanese name, registered under a contract that required her to service a certain number of soldiers per day, and charged for her room, food, clothing, and medical examinations, charges deducted from her earnings in a system of debt that was, by design, nearly impossible to repay. Some women were told their debts would be cleared after 1 year or 2 years, or after a certain number of clients. The debts rarely cleared. The contracts were extended. The women remained. A typical comfort station operated under the following conditions. Women were assigned to small cubicles or rooms divided by thin partitions or hanging curtains. Soldiers came in a regulated sequence, often given numbered tickets, purchased at a military-controlled payment window. Each encounter was allotted a fixed amount of time, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, depending on the rank of the soldier, with officers sometimes given longer access. Women were expected to service anywhere from 10 to 30 men per day on ordinary days, and as many as 50 or more during periods of intense military activity, or when large numbers of troops were moving through the area. They were given condoms, which they were required to keep, partly as a disease prevention measure, and because these condoms were sometimes collected by military health officers as documentation that the requirement had been met. Medical inspection was a regular feature of the system, though it served the health of the soldiers rather than the women. Military doctors conducted weekly or bi-weekly examinations. Women found to have venereal disease were treated, not out of concern for their well-being, but because an infected woman reduced military effectiveness. Some women deliberately sought infection as a means of escaping service for a period, or of sabotaging the system in the only way available to them. The psychological dimension of this experience was crushing in ways that survivors would spend decades struggling to describe. Many women had entered the stations as virgins. The first night, testimonies as a night of repeated assault by multiple men, was, in many cases, followed by years of the same. The shame that Japanese and Korean society attached to sexual activity outside of marriage. The impossibility of explaining to a future husband what happened, the certainty that families would reject them. These realities meant that many survivors maintained silence for decades after the war. Some never spoke. Some took their own lives. The few who did eventually speak, beginning in the 1990s, when South Korean activist groups began encouraging testimonies, described lives shaped entirely by the experience, not just during the war, but afterward in the silence they were forced to maintain, in the marriages that never came, in the bodies that bore the physical consequences of years of assault. In China, the situation carried additional dimensions of ethnic and national humiliation. Chinese women forced into comfort stations experienced not only the sexual violence as Korean and Taiwanese women, the particular brutality reserved for a civilian population that Japanese military ideology had designated as inferior and defeated. Testimonies from Chinese survivors describe a degree of violence, beatings, torture, murder, that exceeded even the already brutal standard of the comfort stations. Women who refused to comply were beaten. Women who became too sick to serve were sometimes killed or left to die. Women who attempted escape were punished severely. In the Philippines, Dutch colonial women held in Japanese prison camps in Indonesia, and Filipino civilians were also subjected to forced recruitment into comfort stations. The Dutch case produced particularly detailed legal documentation after the war, as the Netherlands pursued war crimes prosecutions at Japanese officers responsible for the forced recruitment of Dutch women. In 1948, a war crimes tribunal in Batavia convicted several Japanese officers and sentenced them to death or imprisonment specifically for the coerced recruitment of Dutch women into comfort stations. These convictions represented the only formal legal accountability for the comfort women system in the immediate post-period. The broader system, as it applied to Korean, Chinese, and other Asian women, went almost entirely unpunished. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which ran from 1946 to 1948, did not prosecute the comfort women system as a distinct crime. Prosecutors were aware of it, evidence existed, but a combination of factors, the priority given to other charges, the political desire to maintain Japanese governmental cooperation in the emerging Cold War, and the sheer indifference of the all-male prosecution teams to crimes committed primarily against women, meant that the system was effectively ignored in the most important international forum of the post-war period. Japan's post-war government maintained for decades that the comfort women's system had been a private commercial enterprise managed by civilian brokers involving women who had voluntarily entered the trade. This position was not sustainable against the evidence. In 1992, Japanese historian Yoshiaki Yoshimi discovered documents in the library of Japan's self-defense agency that directly linked the Imperial Army to the establishment and operation of comfort stations. The documents were unambiguous. They authorized the military to build comfort facilities, specified the procedures for recruiting women, and outlined the command structures responsible for managing the system. The discovery triggered a crisis in Japanese politics. In 1993, Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono issued what became known as the Kono Statement, acknowledging that the Japanese military had been directly involved in the establishment and management of the comfort women's system, and that many women had been recruited against their will. The statement expressed apology and remorse. It did not result in formal reparations or legal accountability. In subsequent decades, Japanese governments alternately affirmed and hedged the Kono Statement, and nationalist politicians periodically challenged its characterization of events, reopening wounds that had never truly closed. The survivors who testified, women like Kim Hak-soon, the first Korean survivor to speak publicly in 1991, and the many who followed her, were elderly by then, in their 70s and 80s. They had carried their testimonies for half a century. What they described was not history in the abstract. It was the specific texture of specific rooms, the specific faces of specific men, the specific weight of specific humiliations repeated thousands of times across years. Their willingness to speak, at the cost of social exposure and the revival of trauma, represented one of the most extraordinary acts of historical witness of the 20th century. The legal and political dimensions of the comfort women issue remain unresolved. South Korea and Japan have negotiated several agreements addressing the issue, most recently in 2015. But Korean survivor groups have consistently rejected settlements that they regard as insufficient and as attempts to close the subject without genuine accountability. Statues commemorating the comfort women, modeled on a young girl in traditional Korean dress, seated, have been erected in South Korea, in other countries, and even briefly in some American cities, provoking sharp diplomatic protests from Japan each time. The statues have become symbols not only of the specific history they represent, but of the broader struggle to have that history recognized, acknowledged, and taught to future generations. What happened to the comfort women, not, as its perpetrators claimed, a necessary evil of war, or a commercial arrangement, or a regrettable excess. It was a system designed by military planners, implemented by state power, and sustained for years by a deliberate decision to treat the bodies of women, overwhelmingly men from colonized and conquered populations, as military infrastructure, understanding it as a system, rather than as a collection of individual crimes, is the necessary foundation for understanding how such things become possible and how they might be prevented. Among the most disturbing and least discussed dimensions of Nazi sexual policy was the establishment of forced prostitution within the concentration camp system itself. These weren't brothels adjacent to military bases, as in Japan's comfort station system. They were facilities built inside concentration camps, staffed by women selected from the camp prisoner population under conditions of extreme coercion and used to reward male prisoners, primarily non-Jewish male prisoners, who were designated as productive workers or functionaries within the camp hierarchy. The existence of these facilities was known during the war, was documented by survivors afterward, and was nonetheless absent from public historical consciousness for decades. The decision to establish camp brothels came from Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, in 1942. Himmler's reasoning was characteristically bureaucratic in its framing and monstrous in its implications. He had become concerned about productivity levels in the concentration camps, where forced labor was becoming increasingly central to the war economy. He believed, drawing on assumptions about male motivation that were as cynical as they were dehumanizing, that the promise of sexual access would incentivize male prisoners to work harder. He also believed, consistent with broader Nazi ideology, that the sexual exploitation of concentration camp women was a legitimate use of a resource that the state already controlled. 10 concentration camp brothels were established between 142 and 944. At Mauthausen, Gusen Flossenburg, Neuengamme, Dohamittelbau, Da Salsassenhausen, Buchenwald, Auschwitz-Genau, and the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück, which served as the primary source of women for the system. The facilities were typically designated by the antiseptic nomenclature of Special Block or Sonderbau, and their existence was visible within the camp landscape. Male prisoners could see them, knew what they were, while remaining largely absent from post-war accounts for reasons that reflect both the shame of survivors and the institutional reluctance of post-war German society to confront this dimension of the camp system. The women assigned to camp brothels were drawn primarily from the prisoner population at Ravensbrück, the only major concentration camp exclusively for women. They were recruited, if that word can be used for a process conducted through threats and deception, by SS officers who told women that if they volunteered for special work, they would be released after 6 months, transferred to better conditions, or given other benefits. The women who agreed were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not Jewish. Nazi racial ideology prohibited sexual contact between SS-controlled camp personnel and Jews, and this prohibition extended to the brothel system, at least officially. The women selected were primarily German women convicted of criminal offenses, Polish women, Ukrainian women, and other non-Jewish camp prisoners. The promise of release after 6 months was never honored. Women assigned to camp brothels remained there until the facilities were dismantled as the war ended, or until they were too ill or broken to continue. The conditions were degrading beyond any ordinary description. Women serviced between 6 and 15 men per day, 7 days a week. They had no meaningful ability to refuse individual clients. Refusal brought punishment within the camp system, reduction in food rations, assignment to harsher labor, or direct violence. The physical consequences were severe. Gynecological injuries, repeated venereal infections, and pregnancies that were terminated by camp doctors without the consent of the women involved. The racial dimension of the system produced its own particular logic of horror, because Nazi ideology forbade sexual contact between Jews and non-Jews, defined as Rassenschonung, or racial defilement. Jewish male prisoners in the camps were formally excluded from access to the brothels. In practice, documentation suggests that this prohibition was not always enforced, and that some Jewish prisoners were admitted, but the design of the system was explicitly intended to exclude Jews, and the women who served were explicitly not Jewish, meaning the system simultaneously exploited non-Jewish women while using the promise of sexual access as a sorting mechanism within the male prisoner hierarchy. The male prisoners who used the camp brothels were not uniformly enthusiastic participants. Some accounts suggest that the facilities were used primarily by capos, prisoner functionaries who enforced camp discipline on behalf of the SS, and that ordinary prisoners were ambivalent or reluctant to enter. Some male prisoners refused on moral grounds. Others feared that using the brothels implicated them in the broader system of exploitation. Still others, particularly political prisoners who understood themselves as members of a resistance, regarded the brothels as a deliberately designed mechanism of corruption, intended to compromise prisoners morally and undermine solidarity. The historian Robert Sommer, who produced the most comprehensive scholarly study of the camp brothel system, published in German in 2009, documents cases of political prisoners who organized collective boycotts of the facilities and tried to persuade other prisoners not to use them. For the women inside, the question of agency was entirely illusory. They had agreed under false pretenses, remained under coercion, and endured conditions that would produce lasting physical and psychological damage in all who survived. The post-war fate of these survivors was particularly painful. Many were ashamed to speak about what they had experienced. In Germany, women who had been designated as criminal prisoners, petty thieves, prostitutes, women convicted of abortion, found it difficult to claim victim status in the post-war legal framework, which extended recognition and compensation to political and racial prisoners, but was ambivalent or exclusionary toward those convicted of ordinary crimes. In Poland and other Eastern European countries, survivors faced additional layers of stigma. The combination of having survived the camps at all when so many had not, and the specific nature of what they had survived. The post-war legal silence around camp brothels was profound. The Nuremberg trials did not address them. German war crimes tribunals, in subsequent decades, largely ignored them. The official German compensation system for concentration camp survivors, established in the 1950s, initially excluded women who had been assigned to brothels on the grounds that their experience was not covered by the relevant definitions. This exclusion was not corrected until decades later, and full legal acknowledgement came only gradually, driven by the work of historians, survivors' advocates, and eventually the survivors themselves. The scholarly attention given to camp brothels remained limited until the late 20th century. The reasons are multiple and interconnected. The shame of survivors created silence. The post-war German impulse to construct a narrative of Nazi horror that was recognizable and manageable, focused on the extermination of the Jews, the death marches, the gas chambers, tended to exclude dimensions of the system that complicated the narrative or raised uncomfortable questions about agency, complicity, and the specific forms of gendered violence that the Nazi state deployed. The male prisoner survivors who wrote memoirs and gave testimonies in the decades after the war rarely mentioned the brothels, even when they had existed within the camps where those survivors had been held. It was not until the 1990s and early 2000s that serious historical scholarship began to address the camp brothel system systematically. The publication of Robert Sommer's research and the work of other scholars including Christa Schulz and Helga Emmersberger brought the subject into academic visibility. The 2007 documentary film Prostitution Behind Barbed Wire, based on survivor testimonies, brought it to broader public attention. By then, most of the survivors were dead. The few who remained alive were elderly women who had spent most of their lives not speaking about what had happened to them, and who in some cases found the historical attention was as painful as the silence had been. The camp brothel system must be understood not as an anomaly within the concentration camp universe, but as a logical extension of it. The concentration camp was a total institution in which the SS held absolute power over the bodies of prisoners, their labor, their food, their health, their reproduction, their death. The application of that power to organized sexual exploitation was consistent. Everything else the system embodied. What is particularly important to recognize is that the system operated not through the simple violence of rape, though rape was ubiquitous in the camp context, but through a structure of false promises, bureaucratic assignment, and institutional organization. It was rape made administrative. It was exploitation given the form of policy. And it functioned as Nazi policy so often did, with the involvement of an entire apparatus of officers, doctors, guards, and functionaries who processed, implemented, and sustained it without, apparently, experiencing any significant moral crisis. The women who were forced into this system were not incidental victims of wartime disorder. They were the deliberate targets of deliberate decisions made by identifiable men in positions of authority. Himmler signed the orders. SS commanders built the facilities. Camp doctors conducted the inspections. Male prisoners, some willingly, some under their own forms of coercion, participated as clients. The system existed because people designed it, built it, staffed it, and used it. This is not a comfortable history. It was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to function, and it did. When German forces swept across Western Europe in the spring and summer of 1940, occupying Denmark and Norway in April, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg in May, and France in June, they brought with them not only soldiers and administrators, but an entire apparatus of occupation that quickly encompassed the regulation of sexuality and the control of prostitution. The interaction between German occupying forces and the prostitution infrastructure they found in occupied territories was complex, varied by country and period, and produced a range of experiences for the women involved that resist simple categorization, even as they share certain fundamental characteristics. France presented the most developed and historically entrenched system of regulated prostitution in occupied Europe. The Maison Closes, licensed brothels that had operated under state regulation since the Napoleonic era, continued to function under occupation, with German military authorities quickly moving to establish control over them. German soldiers were assigned to specific establishments, and the French-managed brothels were effectively reorganized into two tiers. Those serving German troops, which were subjected to German military medical inspection standards, and those serving the French civilian population, which continued under the pre-existing French regulatory framework. The women working in these establishments found themselves serving a new clientele that brought its own hierarchies, its own expectations, and its own dangers. The German military authorities in occupied France were preoccupied, as military authorities throughout history have been, with venereal disease. German soldiers were formally prohibited from unauthorized sexual contact with the local population, and the German Military Medical Corps established regular inspection regimes in the licensed establishments it controlled. Women in German-controlled brothels were required to undergo medical examinations, and establishments found to have infected women were temporarily closed. This system, which resembled in its bureaucratic form the pre-existing French regulatory framework, was presented by German military authorities as a public health measure and was operated with the same institutional indifference to the humanity of the women involved that had characterized the French system before it. The women who worked in French brothels under occupation occupied a morally and socially complex position that post-war French society found deeply uncomfortable to examine. Some were women who had been working in the trade before the occupation and continued doing so because they had no other means of survival. Some were newly impoverished women who had entered the trade specifically because of the economic disruption of occupation. Some were women who had been arrested by the French police or the German authorities for various infractions and found themselves effectively assigned to brothels as a form of detention or punishment. And some, a smaller but historically significant group, were Jewish women who had been arrested and, in the chaos and brutality of the occupation's early period, were subjected to sexual violence and exploitation before being deported. The complex question of collaboration, sexual collaboration specifically, became one of the most charged and painful dimensions of post-war French reckoning with the occupation years. Women who had been in relationships with German soldiers, or who were perceived to have consorted with the occupiers in ways that seemed to imply cooperation rather than coercion, were subjected to brutal public humiliation at the liberation. The practice of taunt, the public shaving of the heads of women accused of horizontal collaboration, as it was called, resulted in the humiliation of tens of thousands of pounds of francs in 944 and 14 and 945. Many of those targeted were not collaborators in any meaningful sense. Some were women who had been coerced into relationships with German soldiers, or who had entered those relationships out of desperation rather than sympathy. The rage of the liberated community, so much of it directed at women's bodies rather than at the men who had actually managed the occupation, reflected a gendered logic of shame and punishment that ran deep in French culture. In the Netherlands, the German occupation found a different and more contested landscape. Dutch society was less accustomed to regulated prostitution on the French model, and Dutch women were more likely than French women to be targeted for labor deportation to Germany. A policy that subjected hundreds of thousands of Dutch workers to forced labor in German factories, farms, and in some cases, military brothels. Dutch women working in informal prostitution in Dutch cities found themselves regulated, inspected, and in some cases arrested by the German military authorities, who were simultaneously attempting to exploit and control the local prostitution economy while prosecuting the broader deportation of Dutch. The Eastern European experience of sexual exploitation under German occupation was categorically different in its scale and brutality from what occurred in Western Europe. In Poland, the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, the German occupation operated not on a model of controlled exploitation, but on a model of racial hierarchy and extermination. Poles and Slavic peoples were designated as Untermenschen, subhumans, in Nazi racial ideology. While this designation did not protect women from sexual violence, it complicated the application of regulatory frameworks that were designed, however cynically, to prevent disease and manage sexuality in ways consistent with German soldiers' well-being. In occupied Poland, sexual violence against civilian women was widespread and effectively unpunished. German soldiers who raped Polish women faced minimal formal consequences, particularly in the early years of occupation. The rape of Jewish women was simultaneously prohibited by racial law. Rassenschande remained formally in force and pervasive in practice, particularly in the context of roundups, rotations, and the operations of the mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen. Women in the ghettos, women on deportation trains, women in transit camps, all were subject to sexual violence that official policy theoretically forbade, but that the culture of racial dehumanization and military impunity made routine. The specific experience of Jewish women under Nazi occupation represents a distinct and devastatingly documented category. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had prohibited sexual contact between Jews and Germans, framing it as racial pollution. But this prohibition did not protect Jewish women. It defined them as existing outside the protection of law, while heinously subjecting them to the violence of a system that denied their humanity. In the ghettos, Warsaw, Odessa, Krakow, conditions of extreme overcrowding, starvation, and disease created contexts in which women exchanged sexual access for food, for documents, for protection, or for the small material goods that might keep a family alive for another few days. This was not prostitution in the sense of a commercial transaction freely entered. It was survival under conditions of total deprivation and total threat. The distinction is morally essential even when the transaction involved resembles, on its surface, what would elsewhere be called prostitution. In the Soviet Union, the German invasion that began in June 1940-41 produced a wave of sexual violence against civilian women that has been estimated by some historians to number in the hundreds of thousands of cases. The Einsatzgruppen that followed the advancing German armies through the Soviet Union committed mass murder of Jewish populations and also engaged in mass rape of women of all nationalities before, during, and after the killings. Soviet women in occupied territories, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, were subjected to both the organized sexual exploitation of military brothels established by the German military in occupied cities and the unorganized violence of individual soldiers operating in an environment of racial contempt and military impunity. The German military in the East also established what were called Wehrmacht brothels, facilities serving German soldiers in occupied Soviet and Polish territory. These were distinct from the concentration camp brothels and from the established licensed brothels of Western Europe. Women in Wehrmacht brothels in the East were recruited, in many cases, through coercion, through offers of food or protection, or direct roundups of women who were then forced into service. The ethnic composition of these establishments reflected the racial geography of the occupation. Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and other Slavic women, along with women of various other nationalities, but typically not Jewish women, for reasons of formal racial prohibition, even in a context where the prohibition was frequently violated in practice. The intersection of sexual exploitation and racial ideology was one of the distinctive features of the Nazi occupation across Europe. German policy simultaneously sought to manage and exploit female sexuality while maintaining racial hierarchies that determined which women were considered legitimate objects of exploitation, which were considered beyond the bounds of permitted contact, and which were considered to have no status at all. The result was a system, or rather a collection of overlapping systems, in which virtually all women in occupied territories found their bodies subjected to German power in some way, and in which the specific form that subjection took depended on their national identity, their religion, and their position within the racial hierarchy that Nazi ideology imposed on everyone it touched. The Soviet experience of the Second World War was scale of suffering unparalleled. Approximately 70 to 80 million people who died in the war globally. The Soviet Union lost between 27 and 30 million soldiers and civilians, and in roughly equal measure. This catastrophe touched every family in the country. Memory, Soviet memory, and Soviet identity touched in ways that persisted for decades, and it generated a set of story in sexuality, sex, and survival. Thus, society, Wesley than Western societies, to examine their own. The role of Soviet women in the war was extraordinary in its breadth. Approximately 800,000 women served in the Red Army, a higher number than any other military force in the war. Pilots served tank members, crew members, medics, sappers, and in a wide range of combat and support roles. The female snipers of the Red Army, operating units, achieved and committed kill records. Warfare. The 3 regiments of women aviators, the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, the 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the Bomber Aviation Regiment, and the 5th Aviation Regiment, a Bomber Aviation Regiment, the last of which named the Night Witches for their nighttime raids, became symbols of Soviet women's wartime. The official Soviet narrative of the war, the Great Patriotic War, as it was known, contribution extensively. Memorials to the heroic Soviet women, rifle, hand, or childed across the crest, appeared across the country. The official culture of wartime and for commemoration. Building space. The female partisan. The female perfectly worker weapons for the front. What it did not make space for was any acknowledgement of an actual dimension of women's wartime experience. Not the inconflict against Soviet women by the German occupiers. Not the informal sexual economies that developed developed within the Red Army itself, and most certainly not the experiences of Soviet women who for whatever reason, found themselves sexually compromised under occupation. The German occupation of vast swaths of Soviet territory brought immediate and devastating odds against civilian women in the first weeks and the invasion. In Julian's great soldier met women freak feeling and openness and weaknesses. Oh, but of military impunity that German command structures in the East emitted, and the racial ideology a defined Slaviomen, Siwanen and NFO, and therefore without claim to legal protection. Soviet propaganda quickly made use of cases in middle help. Please. Post soldiers described as they had fought revenge. Held for revenge. This mobilization of the reality of sexual violence did not produce the situation of Soviet women living in German-occupied territory was one directional of danger. Women who were visibly Jewish and one sexual phrase to a family, and the impossible moral calculations of survival. Occupation in some occupied in Soviets to involve the vermin in the German economy. Women exchanging sex. That's for food or protection. Though total protection the cross range of involved women who survived the occupation that survived the occupation and were dancing for years from is so daisy. The Soviet state and Soviet society regarded anyone lived in a German who had legitimated with deep suspicion. Collaborators defined broadly and applied insistently. Faced arrest, beyond the legal category of collaboration, The social stigma attached to occupation survival was pervasive. Women who had had any contact with German soldiers through race, news, or through any days, or through anything I'd be described as voluntary, found themselves regarded with suspicion or contempt by they returned to the experience of Soviet engined captivity added another dimension. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet women worded to Germany as forced laborers. As Ostarbeiter, Eastern workers, designated by a badge that identified them as racially inferior and subjected to conditions of labor that produced high rates of death among the women deported for labor, sexual exploitation by German employers, supervisors, and soldiers was widespread. The German state theoretically prohibited the German and Eastern workers. Again, the racial prohibition but enforcement was lax. The power differential between German employers and their Soviet forced laborers was absolute. Women who became pregnant were whether and through under pendency, perforced altars, German camp doctors, women who survived deportation and forced labor in Germany, and were repatriated to the Soviet said to interrogation by the NKVD, the Soviets. And captivity. The interrogations to identify collaborators and persons who have been mated by contact with the enemy. Women who described rape were sometimes believed. Women who had been in any relationship with a German man, however coerced, risked being classified as collaborators. The repatriation experience was, for many women, a second ordeal comparable in its trauma to the captivity itself. The sexual violence committed by Soviets both against the German civilian population, during the advance into Germany, and against women, and women and their European countries liberated by the Red Army. The Red Army presents a dimension of the worst of of the war's sexual history, both documented and deeply uncomfortable for the narrative of the Soviet Union as the liberating power of World War. As Soviet forces advanced into Germany in 1945, in East Prussia and Pomerania, Berlin was committed on a scale historians have estimated hundreds of thousands, over millions, to over 1 million cases. The rapes were committed by soldiers of the Red Ants of Vinzoveta, of German civilian children that included Windfeulen, all ranged from young girls to elderly women. Causes that Soviet planets have been extensively debated by historians. Some have emphasized the culture of military impunity. Soviet commands the Germany's permitted commanding officers who dismissed rape as a trivial matter, and in the context of the larger war, who sometimes actively participated. Some emphasized the rage of Soviet soldiers who witnessed the devastation of the bunker and their own kind, and who guarded civilians of retribution. Some have noted the specific cause of rape as lastlinkwas essembraskel and kalgetens som bodies and bodies and saw women's body to be clad along liberty and property. The combination of these factors gives the asterisk women's us in its scale and its comprehensiveness of the violence of the war. German women who survived the mass rapes of 945, and who later tried what had happened a bit. Encountered in a culture of silence society that's immediately impossible. Discussion, nearly impossible. The memoir Anonymous, published first in English in 1954, and then in German in 1959, and then in German in 1959. Is the extraordinary account of Berlin's experience of the Soviet occupation in the city in the spring of 19 including her decision to find a specific high-rank Soviet the protector against the random violence ordinary soldiers. The book, subjected by German women when it's first published in seen and inappropriate. The author published it anonymously. In her lifetime, it was reissued after her death into her deathy, and 2003, and theme received serious reserved. So experiences of sexual violence and sexual exploitation during the war are only now decades after the conflict ended, beginning to receive systematic historical attention. The ideological framework of the Great Patriotic War, which required a number of survival, effectively suppressed this history in the Soviet. In Russia, since oral history projects, archival research on transformation of post-memory culture of the law. Invisible, the women who lived through these experiences deserve a history about what they endured, as respectful what they survived. When the war ended in Europe in 1940, in August 1945, the world began the painful, the prideful process of counting its dead and prosecuting its criminals and deeds, and rebuilding its shattered societies. This process was seeking complex and enormously incomplete. Respects to the intentions of wartime violence. The women who had been subjected to sexual exploitation crossed theaters of the war, in Japanese comfort stations, in Nazi concentration camp brothels, in territories, occupied terrorist Europe, and Asia, in the informal economies of sodomies that developed wherever women met civilian populations, found that the world that from the war very limited interest in their specific experiences. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, can invite over long teen nocturne for insects, escape. Predicted 1986. 2024 med 24 mærket the England that included crimes against peace, war crimes, unquent crimes, and crimes against humanity. The indictments and proceedings addressed extermination of the Jews, the slave labor program, the mistreatment of prisoners of war, and the looting of territories. They did not that discipline others, except that had been a feature of the Browsing Europe or you had the camp brothel system. This was not because the evidence was absent. Survivors were available, documents existed, but because the prosecutions operating within a legal framework, that had only recently developed the concept of crimes against humanity. Van Kaplan them once and more central to their narrative. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal formally tribunal for the fighting ran from 946 to 946 to 906 948 and prosecuted 48 points on similar charges. As noted earlier, this system and space, despite the instability of evidence testimony, the reasons, both legal and political, the legal framework of the time did not clearly did not grasp him as a capable war crime, prosecutable crime. Not be formally recognized as a crime against humanity under international law until the 1990s. Following the tribunals established to address the conflicts. Former Lavia. And the politics, the United States dominated the Tokyo preserve governmental cooperation rather than to push the bullshit. The Allied military occupation of Germany and both Drupnaniadzo paternal double truth of sexual mediated. Post-war period. In Germany, the division of the country among American, French, and Soviet zones excludes created a situation especially it was active in the disparity between the occupying and the devastated German civilian populating generated informal exchange of sexual exchange. German women who had access to the goods that Allied soldiers possessed. Nylon Cooklet could trade sexual access for material survival. This was not identical to prostitution in the pre-war sense. But it was not meaning furry either. Well, something meaning to either occur conditions of extreme climate and occupied in Ben in Japan, the American occupation of the North on 1845, within days of the Japanese government had established an amusement association, Rai, a nominally primarily private organization that recruited Japanese women to staff as establishments designed to service American occupation troops. The recruitment was conducted under the same of deception and economic risk, and the characterizing word sister women were the or dancers were not told they would be recalled, but provide sexual services. The Japanese government funded the RAAA, and presented it as a larger perspective to tourist movements from violence, a class of what for other class to protect another class. The American occupation authorities tolerated rifles for several months, fully featuring the American troops in January 1946. 46, partly in response to criticism from American journalists in the United States. In the United States, the rise, the abolition, and promote abound and invented. It simply changed its organizational structure. The Yoshiwara district and other red light areas of other cities and their cities entities continued to serve both Japanese and men and American soldiers. Complex of establishments that grew up around American military bases, called by Americans the Pan Girls and by Japanese society, with a combination of contempt and desperate acknowledgement. Throughout the occupation period and beyond, the women involved occupied a social position of profound ambiguity, stigma, as victims of the occupation economy, nor allowed out in identity. Identity for the survivors of the worst war times they were done when camp brothels. The post-war decades were characterized by silence, by shame, and by the failure of the legal and political systems established as wartime crimes to acknowledge their specific experiences. Many survivors were unable to return to their home communities because of occupations. Experiences. Many could not form families. But they had sustained because guys explaining that potential husband in societies where female experience acceptance of stigmatized. Some moved to city valleys where they were unknown and built around of constituent of their histories. Some that were the damage died snaggetting. So their own lawyer took their own lives. The silence was not only known as individual, but institutional. Governments might have been victimized citizens. The Korean government, the Philippine government, the Dutch government, in respect of its citizens, had their own reasons, for not pressing the issue forcefully. Post-war decades, the 1957-51 treaty, which formally did the State of One and the Allied powers, addressed reparations in broad terms, did the comfort women issue, the 1965 norm South Treaty, South Korea normalization plan no Japanese government subsequently resolved all outstanding compensation claims. A position that Korean survivor groups have vigorously rejected on the grounds that the treaty was negotiated without knowledge of or see with survivors, the station system, the turn toward peaking toward breaking the long silence came gradually, getting in the late 1990s. Through the 1990s, in South Korea, the emergence of decades of authoritarian rule and wartime experienced premiumist been suppressed. The feminist movement growing in strength and began its training sprint against survives peace as woods and influence goes more than experiments and let's discuss rather than drugs. Korean researchers began conducting interviews with surviving comfort women. When Kim Hak-soon became the first Korean in August 1991, she in 91 he opened a tender that had been sealed for 40 years. The testimonies that followed from Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, Filipino, Dutch, and Indonesian survivors were not simply historical documents. They were of personal and political courage by elderly women who had cited in their lives had been done to them. The testimony process was itself often traumatic. Survivors described reliving, in the act of telling, experiences they had spent decades thinking. But the decision to speak was also, for many survivors, an act of agency that they had been denied for their lives. For most of their lives, they were not going to die with the world not having the legal and political response was slow and contested and ultimately inadequate. Japan's government moved through a series of positions: denial, partial acknowledgement, the Kono Statement, 1993, hedging and retraction, 2015 agreement with South Korea, none of which satisfied survivors or their advocates. International legal scholars argued. In the reviews, with increasing crimes against humanity, a form of slavery category that categories if applied consistently, would require far more than governmental expressions of regret. The argument has prevailed in scholarly and human rights discourse. It has remained in diplomatic and legal terms in Germany. In Germany, the reckoning with sexual crimes of the Nazi period followed in similar trajectory. The camp brothels entered Gallidsger only any 90. The survivor of only the Eastern Ellis 2000s. The question of compensation for survivors of the camp brothels who had been plundered, passengers, internal prisoners, and therefore excluded from the initial penis war. German was addressed very partially and late. The broader question of sexual violence genitive ads about and genocide, about the specific forms that mass violence takes when it's directed against women, and then about the institutional and cultural conditions that such violence to be perpetrated, to be sustained, to be denied. The history of sexual exploitation in the World War is not for a chapter from the history of the war. It is woven through that history at every level. In the planning decisions, military leaders of occupying powers, in the experiences of civilian alien populations, in the post-war poor legal frameworks failed to fully account for it, and in the long silence that followed, to understand the war fully, to understand total war means for the human beings caught within it, and especially for the women who are always among its most vulnerable and most systematic targeted. Is to understand that the violence was not only in the battles and the bombing raids, the death camps, but in the organized, systematic, and deliberate and spotty devices as of military policy. That exploitation is part of the war's history. Main part of how we remember and what happened. History does not end with the events gods. It continues in its Midishma. who to commemorate, who to honor, and which silences to maintain. The history of sexual exploitation in the Second World War has, in the decades since, been 945 been the subject and ongoing and still unresolved contest of memory over memory, recognition, accountability, meaning. That contest has taken place in courtrooms and elements, in archives and classrooms, in the streets of in subsolids of Seoul and Seoul and Berlin and The Hague. In the private lives of survived land, their remaining years, demanding that the world acknowledge what was done to them. The legal framework of international Hurrian law has been Trojan law and transformed in part by the belated recognition this international crime. The tribunals is established in the 1990s to and as crime day farmer use from ways in were the first international to treat systematic rape and cessplanks spy right against lifetime dates. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which entered into force in 2002, explicitly listed rape, solicited rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and other forms of sexual violence as crimes and war crimes. These legal developments represented communities willingness let's study serious as a serious ability that accountability transformation that would not have occurred occurred much more slowly without pressure of advocacy groups, feminist legal scholars and survivors of precise kinds women. In the Second World War, the discomfort that surrounds this history in the present day is real, and has multiple sources. For Japan, the comfort women's reigned for minds remained asked of the some national identity and the reality and the relationship between Japan, its former colonial subjects, conservative Japanese politicians and commentators, hard. You've challenged the historical consensus on the comfort women system, arguing that the women willing in participants in a commercial arrangement, that the numbers have been exaggerated, or Japanese, or no direct responsibility for the actions of recruiters. These arguments have been rejected by the community on the basis of documentary evidence, but have persisted in political discourse. Reflecting the broader difficulty that nationalist politic in any country with honest engagement with atrocity. For Germany, the Camp Bravo, so das ist Slan and modern visit and the red spells number aspects of the period of the Nazi period. Germany's post-war culture, Verganji Geheitsbewältigung, gun. Has been, by any international standard, unusually thorough and serious. Holocaust education is mandatory in German schools. Cost denial, illegal. Memorials, atoms. Victim, German space, but the specific of so it is cancer and cells that memories that gives one reads and it's nuts. Partly because of the particular shame attached to it. Part of the complications that to deduce the narrative of victim and perpetrator. Portland and part of mounting naps and not mapity groups to not member category killers. Has developed for the survivors who are still alive. And Ellen I win in the enemy. The last witnesses to events that occurred more than 80 years ago. Insufficient. The women who testified before the Japanese Diet in the 1990s in participations before public hearings before international human rights bodies, who gave testimony in the implementation projects. Organizations like the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance have expressed repeatedly and with great clarity. Film. They want formal acknowledgement that the comfort wisdom they want more legal accountability, not merely governmental expressions of regret. They want compensation that reflects the magnitude what was done to them. Not a lump sum payment. The political question, and they want the history taught to Japanese children, to Korean children everywhere, so that the knowledge what happened does not die with the last survivors. These demands not fully met. The question of constitutes an adequate response and specified as low as summer has been answered. Nov. No apology, no verses of event. It aids. No legal verdict returns what was taken, what remains possible, and what the survivors have asked for above all. The refusal to look away, the commitment to accurate historical record, and the acknowledgement that the women who were subjected to these crimes were human beings whose lives and experience tunes into matter, and whose suffering was not an inevitable cost of war, but the result of deliberate decisions have made yet identifiable positions of power. The implications of this history extend beyond the Second World War. The systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Specific forms of cruelty and exploitation documented in the comfort station system, the camp brothels. Has recurred in conflicts since 1945 from the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s and the to the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the 21st century, campaigns of the Islamic States beginning in 2014. Each time the pattern is recognizable. Women's bodies territory, sexual violence, systematic rape deployed as an instrument of ethnic cleansing or cleansing of cultural destruction, and the survivors left to carry the burden of a trauma that their societies find it easier to ignore than address the recognition that this pattern is accidental and that reflects power, ideology and institutional design that can be identified and challenged is one of the most important importations but the explain as a merciful they can make the comfort women are not victims of an inimitable when the camp brothels were not the abable casualty of a war that had to be fought. They were the victims of specific policies. Special by specific people, the set is invaluable. As more valuable than others, and some bodies as available for exploitation. To understand those policies, those people, and those structures is beginning of us kagigi and resist them when they appear again. The memorials have been built for the comfort women, the statues the statue of the seated girl, the peace monuments erected in Korea and South Korea and beyond are memorials to the past. They are arguments about present and the future. They argue that the overtaken into non-instruments and continues mattered. That the crime committed again had acknowledged redressed. They argue that the recognition of historical injustice is not merely an in Adam a moral obligation with ongoing political implications. The protests they generate, the diplomatic pressure applied by Japanese governments seeking their removal, the protests of Koreans and Korean IS communities insisting on their right to exist, our right to exist, are a continuation of the historical argument itself, a demonstration that the events of more than 80 years ago remain uncontested and contested. The generation that directly experienced this is nearly gone. The last survived bosses that also repents ex-melodies. The mass rapes of it, they have their years. When they are gone, the history they carry their parent in their bodies, in their memories, entirely undocuments these memories the scholarship, and the commemorative culture thing that remain. The choices made now about how to preserve that history, how to teach it, how to represent it in museums, and in turn will determine what future generation about what happened to women in the Second World War. This history is not easy to teach or to learn. It involves violence, exploration, in ways comfortable, clean moral lessons. It requires engaging with the specific and terrible circumstances as in the black's lives or women's lives. The 14-year-old Korean girl, she would work in a factory. The Polish woman assigned to a camp brought under that all of us promises release. The Berlin woman deciding find a protector in a city under assault. All their specificity, humanity. It requires confronting the and that made a proposal and the post-war silences and the silences forgotten or minimized. It requires, above all, taking seriously the testimony of women. The women's has great personal cost to make sure the world knew what had happened to them. The obligation to listen and to act on what we have heard does not end with the telling.